Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Data Standard Audio Experience. Today, I have Kevin Day, the founder of the Fantasy Football Calculator. And today, we're speaking more about fantasy football. So, welcome to the show, Kevin. It's so great to have you today.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
Yeah. And could you tell us more about yourself and just introduce yourself?
Sure. And my name is Kevin Day. As you said, I'm the founder of Fantasy Football Calculator. It's actually been an interesting career journey to get here. So I've actually been working on Fantasy Football Calculator for 15 years. It's mostly been a side project until recently. But I actually went to college for mechanical engineering at Case Western Reserve, and I studied mechanical engineering there and went to work at General Electric at GE Lighting for 2 years, where I learned how to make light bulbs and spent some time in a manufacturing plant. While I was there, I built this fantasy football website on the side called Fantasy Football Calculator. Never even intended for it to be a business at first, but it actually just sort of grew organically. And I leveraged that experience to shift my career into software. So I live in Cleveland, Ohio. I've lived here my whole life. And I've actually started working at different software startups in the area in Northeast Ohio, and worked my way up from software developer to manager to director to, and then my most recent job, I was the VP of engineering for RV Share for 5 years. And I got to see that startup grow from, I was employee number 8, I believe. And I think they have over a couple hundred employees at this point. And then I had a great experience there, and actually just last month left my position as VP of engineering at RV Share to work on Fantasy Football Calculator full time, because it's grown enough over the years, just kind of like a slow and steady wins the race kind of thing. And fantasy sports and sports in general are rebounding a lot after COVID. People are excited to cheer for their home team again. And so I have a kind of an interesting background of traditional engineering and software development and entrepreneurship.
Yeah, that's super fun and exciting. It's great that you were able to see, in your previous position, how a startup can really grow throughout just the transition. And you're also able to see that within the company that you're working on right now. And fantasy football is huge, especially as you had mentioned, sports kind of coming back after COVID. So it's going to be very exciting to see everything and all the fans kind of coming out to do all the sports betting and all that. And how did you think about this company mission? What kind of sparked this idea for you? And how did you kind of know that there was a need for this in the field?
Yeah, so I really stumbled on it. I wish I could say I did a lot of market research and did this thorough analysis, but it was really more just a stumbling into it as a fan of football and fantasy football. I was in a fantasy football league and just there weren't the right tools or analysis that out there that I thought that there could be. Had a vision for having some graphs and numbers and data and projections that didn't exist. So I built this Fantasy Football Calculator website on my own. Like I said, it really resonated with a lot of customers and has grown over time. What I think I've found my sweet spot in is with my personal skill sets, and with what these my customers are looking for is I can take a lot of raw data and summarize it in user-friendly ways, whether it's data visualization or different reports or different tools to make it either presented well or make it interactive. I've been able to take just a lot of things that might seem like raw data and present it to customers in ways that are helpful to them, because fantasy sports is a hobby. It's supposed to be fun. And I especially when I started out, I found out there were just a lot of sites that were ugly, or they presented data in the wrong way, or what weren't exactly what I was looking for. So I try to go out of my way to think about the end user and not just give them numbers, but give them insights and something usable so that they're enjoying their hobby.
Yeah, definitely. And this specific field, it's growing a lot. And a lot of people are very interested in the fantasy football leagues and everything. So super interesting to hear it from your perspective as well. And how did your past background and experience help with this new application for the fantasy football rankings?
So I'd say there were really two specific ways, both equally important, that my background helped me with this. And one is on the more simple side with the fundamentals of data analysis. So when I was in college, I learned logistic regression, linear regression, and I took some econometrics. I learned how to look for covariance in data sets and things like that. Back before it was kind of old, like before machine learning was even a phrase that people use. They're just engineers doing regression analysis without any crazy techniques they have today, but just the fundamentals of, hey, I've got this data set. How do I get some insights from it? and reliably and present it. So my background helped me with like those fundamentals. But the other side of it, it was also really understanding that the data analysis only is useful if it's only valuable if it's useful to the end user and customer or whoever is going to be consuming this. And I had this really very kind of harsh but important learning lesson when I was working in a manufacturing plant where I was just like a year out of college. I was excited about all this data analysis techniques and tools that I had learned. And I taught myself the R programming language, which was, I could not quite knew then, but there weren't many other engineers that knew how to use R. So I was doing a lot of just trying to find any data sets I could to make a bunch of graphs and find some eureka moment and then make the company a lot of money. So I ended up doing that and spending like a whole month on this manufacturing data that was for one machine that made one part for a light bulb, because it was in a ceramic manufacturing plant. And a lot of the specifics escape me and aren't that important, but it was essentially a whole data stream of temperatures and pressures. So I found all these correlations and did these graphs and graphs and graphs and visualizations. And I was so excited. I had this like 20-page reports that I had just been working on all by myself. And then when I went to present it to the person who is the floor manager and who was running those machines, and he looked at it and was just kind of confused, like why is this kid giving me this like 20-page report? Because he's managing shifts, he's trying to he has quotas and things like that are way very specific to his worldview and what he was working on. And it turned out like the data set I worked on was like a super hot day outside, so he ended up running all the temperatures like 10 degrees lower. The summary is that my whole report was essentially worthless. And I had spent so much time on it. It was very dejecting at the time, but the end result was I definitely learned that it's really important to focus on the end user because it can be exciting and fun sometimes to just geek out on the data side. But so you really have to flip it around and start with a question of, what am I trying to achieve? What would they find valuable? And in what format would they find it valuable? And then work backwards from there to find, all right, what data techniques are helpful to answer that question? So that was the other big thing I learned from my traditional engineering career.
Yeah, definitely a lot of transferable skills that you were able to take from your past experiences and bring them over to what you're doing today. And I wanted to also jump into the idea of just data right now, and I want to talk about that. What are some things that you and your team need to think about before you start processing the data or you start working and playing with the data? How do you know that what you're working on will have an accurate outcome?
Yeah, so it's a great question and something I always have to think about. There's two different types of data sets that I work with. One is raw statistics of game results from, let's say, hey, Tom Brady threw 300 yards and 2 touchdowns and 2 interceptions on this date, and they went to these players, et cetera. So that data is generally pretty easy to work with, except that I still have to. It's never like 100% accurate. You always have to try to find like the one edge case or so where, for example, there's weird cases of at one point there were 2 players called Adrian Peterson in the league at the same time. So you have to make sure that one, your data is correct in identifying the right Adrian Peterson, and that your data sets has also identified them correctly as well. So part of that is one technique just simply is I store all my data in a database and making sure I use either unique database keys in my database where if I try to load 2 different, if I have a key of one player for this game ID, there should only be one of them. And so a lot of things with just data integrity within a normal, MySQL or Postgres database are critical as like just a baseline to making sure that your data makes sense. And then you can kind of dive into anomalies there if you find anything out of the ordinary. And then the other set is with user-generated data. So I actually have a lot of user-generated data on my site as well. And I started by trying to manage the data and delete and filter out data that looked anomalous, or there was someone trying to screw up the data either maliciously or accidentally. And over time, I actually worked to try to move up further in the chain to prevent that data from even getting into my system in the first place. So if someone was trying to maliciously modify the data just for fun or to try to, like I said, be a jerk, I would actually proactively, cut that user off and then immediately remove their data. So for user generated content can be the messiest, but it's also can be some of the most valuable as well. So it's worth it to build those checks and balances into filtering out user generated data.
Yeah, definitely. And for my final question, I wanted to also talk to you about how you kind of just envision the future of your company. How do you kind of see it changing within the next couple of years or just evolving?
So great question. So it's for me personally, it's exciting because I've now taken the leap to work on this full time. So I have, at the same time, more hours in the day, but I'm the kind of person where I've already filled up all those hours. I have all the things that I wanted to do, plus and then some already on my plates, which is just exciting in a fun way. And I think you mentioned at the beginning of the call, just sports betting itself, and that is probably the most greenfield opportunity that I want to work towards getting into, because that is it. It meshes well with the mission statement I mentioned earlier, which is taking a lot of raw data and raw stats and converting that into something that's really valuable to the end customer. So if you're not familiar with sports betting, you might think that it's just people betting on who's going to win this game, what team, who's going to win that game. But it's actually, if you get into it and have the time and money and want to make it a hobby, there's so many different levels of sports betting you can get into with point spreads and futures of who's going to win the MVP award. You can get into how many player props, which is how do you think Tom Brady is going to throw for over 312 and a half passing yards this week? If so, there's some sports book that's going to give you odds on that. And so imagine, every Sunday that there's, an NFL game, hundreds of different types of bets you can have. And on top of that, you can combine those into parlays. So you can have a really high payoff for a couple of low probability bets you can make. So you can turn $20 into $1,000, but you probably won't, but there's a small chance you will. So there's all these data-driven questions that people want answers to. And I would like to be able to try to leverage, football projections and different sports lines or betting lines to try to find, which bets are maybe easiest or softest or easiest to win money at, or just help people navigate that very colossally, complex landscape, because sports betting is slowly growing to be more legal in more states across the United States. In addition to being legal in many countries in the world, but it's growing as an industry, and there's a lot of consumers who just need some help and they're looking for guidance, whether it's free advice or paid advice. There's just a combination of opportunities there that I'll probably be going into.
Yeah, and I'm very excited to see how it'll grow in the next coming years as well. Thank you so much, Kevin, for joining me today. It was so great to have you on the show today. And where can everyone find you online to connect with you?
Yeah, so I'd say the best place is Twitter. My Twitter handle is Kday, Kday. And yeah, I'm active there, and they can find me there. And I love to always, reach out and talk to people and hear how others are using data and what projects they're working on. And I can talk about sports and data and fantasy football as long as people will listen. So if anyone's curious to hear what I'm doing, I'm always glad to talk.
Yeah. And to our audience, for more information on the Data Standard, you can find us at www.datastandard.io, as well as on our LinkedIn and YouTube channel. And thank you so much, Kevin, for joining me. It was so great to have you and just hear more about the work that you're doing with your company. So I hope to speak to you again soon.
Great. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.